Hello, this is Dr. Schemberger, and this week we will focus on business journalism. I know it might not sound exciting, however, this is an important beat. When I was a news reporter, on top of the education news, which of course, as you know, I really enjoyed, as well as covering the courts, this beat was added to my list. In fact, I was encouraged to explore business journalism as a third news beat. So I immediately kind of dived in. I looked into instruction and training from the Donald Reynolds Business Center, which coordinated a lot of this. And I even went to seminars. The newspaper I worked for at the time would fund those opportunities for me. And what this did is that it allowed me to learn more about business because it is important. Basically, it's going to be important in any beat that you do. And we will talk a little bit about that. But why study business journalism? Well, I think the best argument for that is because you don't know where your career is going to take you, as it did for me. Even though I was an education news reporter first and then the courtroom reporter second, business journalism was where I started to realize how everything really operates. In 2002, there was a survey done, and these types of surveys have been replicated over time, or other similar surveys have been done. Basically, these surveys indicate that news executives, those in leadership positions such as editor, producer, director, etc., they want people who graduate from journalism programs to have an understanding of how the business world works. And so I've even had some of my good friends in the media who are news leaders, and they've even told me, you're gonna have to find a way to teach these students how does business work? What is the difference between a public company and a private company? How can they read financials better? Because reading financials is an important part of any beat, not just business journalism. So thus, we're going to focus on this. In addition, in 2014, I received a fellowship to spend a week, which I did, but I spent a week at Arizona State University in Phoenix. So this was 6 years ago. And during that time, I learned how to put together business journalism instruction and curriculum. We've never been able to really offer a separate course in business journalism as I wished we would. Much of the reason is because students are just not interested. So therefore, I integrate it into other courses that I teach. Even my 194 class, they get some very basic concepts. So you're getting more of the expanded version, if you will, of this kind of topic. The need for business journalism has always existed, and we'll study that in just a few moments. However, it didn't really start to surface again incredulously until about 2001. And during that time, we were faced with various embezzlements and schemes going on, even in the corporate world. So corporations such as Enron and WorldCom and Adelphia, those items that basically how those companies were not investing, taking the money out of employees' paychecks, and those were not being invested like they said they would into retirement accounts. So then a lot of these employees didn't have any retirement whatsoever, and it caused a lot of problems. So also in 2008 and 2009, we had some problems, of course, with recession. And again, business journalism, there was a need for that. News consumers have always questioned whenever things go wrong in the business climate, where are the business journalists? How can we understand what's going on in the world better? So there is a need for business journalism. So let's talk about the history of business journalism for just a few moments. Really, it has existed for as long as this country has existed. So even our early settlers were relying on newspapers to tell them all about when ships were going to come in with certain goods. Also, what were the prices of crop and livestock at that time? And then in the 19th century, newspapers would form that were devoted only to business journalism news. Now, that's not to say that the other papers didn't cover business. They did. They would cover other things. But news publications such as the Journal of Commerce and the Wall Street Journal, they focused exclusively on business news, as the Wall Street Journal continues to do so today. And then throughout the late 1890s and then going into the early part of the 20th century, we started to see newspapers directing their news staffs to cover how companies were affecting the lives of people. So for instance, we all like to celebrate July 4th, and one of the ways to do that is to have fireworks. Well, in 1899, Chicago Daily Tribune began to publish stories about how these fireworks and other explosives were killing people each year. And what this did is it prompted restrictions on how fireworks were made and sold. So we even had a role in the development of how things should be more effective in the markets. And then later, business journalism would continue to develop when we would see journalists focusing more on investments. Much of this is thanks to Charles Ponce. In 1920, the Boston Post newspaper uncovered the financial wrongdoings that he was doing. He was taking people's money and pocketing it, saying that he could reinvest that money and make greater returns, and then, of course, issue the profits. That wasn't happening though. So when that occurs, that is known as a Ponzi scheme. So you might be familiar with that term or have heard that term, but that's what it means, is that someone has kind of defrauded someone, and that's what Charles Ponzi did. Business journalism also expanded to consumer news, and what consumer news does is it helps people to understand which products they should buy. So even when we have consumer news reports, the monthly magazine that helps news readers to find out more information about a product or a service, or maybe even something in that area. How can those products be good? How are they might be questionable? Where people should invest that kind of money? A good example was that in 1959, the Nation publication no longer exists, but consumer advocate Ralph Nader investigated automobile safety. And what his work did is that it then forced federal regulations on seat belts, recalls, and all those types of issues. Basically, the reasons you have recalls today stems a lot from the work that Ralph Nader did in 1959. Business journalism has continued to evolve even more. We now have a news service, Bloomberg News, that's devoted to business journalism. Dow Jones, Reuters. So a lot of those news services now provide a business wire that is really helpful to news publications and thus their news audiences. Even though business journalism is great, we would start to see some challenges to this field. Think about how corporate executives, because we would have information coming out about products, services, the good and the bad, you can imagine how corporate executives might be feeling about that kind of news, and they were blaming the business journalists for those problems. So we have the rise of public relations as a result. So in other words, we're going to have somebody now who can kind of help to turn the tide on some of the negatives of business journalism news. So the rise of PR in the 50s and 60s, that started to lead to a period in which it was a challenge for business journalism. Our access to company executives was being narrowed. The 1980s and the 1990s, better decades for us as business journalists. But the problem we were seeing was that some business reporters were becoming investors themselves. And when you become an investor, you're not going to really disclose your sources a whole lot. You're going to protect your investment. And so sometimes too, they were maybe even leaking information before the articles were published. So there were some ethical issues to come about from all of that. But overall, news outlets were just missing business news entirely. It was a hit and miss operation. And as a result, the quality of business news would suffer. So the problems we have today mostly is perception. People want better business coverage. Think about all that's going on with COVID-19, especially when in regards to the CARES Act, stimulus payments. People want to know, when's that money going to hit their checking accounts? Or if it's not, how can they be eligible? If they're eligible, what can they expect? This is where, again, business journalism can be helpful, and not just with the individuals, but also with companies. What does the stimulus mean for healthcare? What does the stimulus mean for colleges and universities? This is where business journalism can be helpful. So what do you need to know? Well, first of all, when we say business journalism, people immediately think numbers. Yes, you do have to work with numbers, but you've got to understand what you're writing about. You've got to know the terms. Revenue and net income. Those are differences between the two terms, and we'll talk about that. Basically, revenue is all the money's brought in, and then net income is what a company gets to pocket after all bills are paid. Okay, so you've got to understand that kind of terminology. You also just have to have an understanding about the ins and outs of business. Really what kind of makes this the business world tick, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But really, what you need to know is that the business and the economy are related to everything. Everything that you choose to eat, whatever you choose to buy, um, anything you do, there's a dollar sign attached to it. And if there's a dollar sign attached to it, then there's a need for business journalism. So we'll talk more about this really fascinating beat. And for that, that will conclude at least this introductory part. So make sure to click on the next tab to learn more about the next topic in business journalism. Thank you for your attention.